It's so good to see everyone here tonight. Thank you for coming. My name is Jennifer Anderson. I teach creative nonfiction, publishing arts, and composition at LC State. I'm also the faculty advisor for Talking River Review, our college's student-run literary journal, which is celebrating our 30th year this year. So we're so excited about that. This is LC State's 43rd annual Stegner Lecture. This lecture, established in 1982 with Wallace Stegner as the inaugural speaker, has long been a literary and cultural highlight for the college and the larger Lewiston-Clarkston community, featuring discussions about the writer's relationship with the physical and psychological territories in which they reside. Past speakers have included Edward Abbey, Norman McLean, Linda Hogan, Terry Tempest Williams, Robert Wrigley, who is here tonight, Natalie Diaz, and C. Marie Furman, who is also here tonight, amongst so many others. Tonight we are so honored to feature Kim Barnes. This is her second time delivering the lecture. The first was in 2013. And I have to say, in preparation for tonight's event, last night, Marlo Daly Galeano's American Literature students and my creative nonfiction students read Barnes's essays, Ashes of August and Carne Santificata. Inspired by these pieces, they wrote their own works and gathered together to share. And we shared for over 2 hours. And it was an illuminating evening of storytelling about place, and just as tonight's lecture will be as well. I would like to thank my colleagues in the Humanities Division for their generous help with and support of this event, specifically the Visiting Writers Committee, Marlo Daly Galeano and Louis Sylvester. I'd also like to thank our Administrative Assistant Leilani Farrell, our Division Chair Amanda Van Lannen, Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean Martin Gibbs, Brian Kolstad, and his graphic communications student Ryan Corelli, who designed the poster for this event. Thanks to Lawrence Sanders in Communications and Marketing for recording the lecture, which will be posted to our Humanities Division's YouTube channel at a later date. Oh, and I have to say, our past lectures have been digitized, and they are up on our Humanities channel, and so you can check out some of our previous ones going back to the 80s and 90s, and so please check those out as well. And finally, thank you to Lynn Johnson, Director of the Lewiston City Library, and her staff, Brad and Landry, for lending us this beautiful space for tonight's event. This community event was also made possible by an LC State institutional grant, as well as by a generous contribution from the Rose Hill Fund. I'm now going to turn it over to Cami Darnold, Publishing Arts major at LC State. She will introduce Kim, and following the lecture, there will be time for questions. There are also books for sale at the back of the room, which I'm sure Kim will be happy to sign for you. And C. Marie Furman is also selling her book back there as well. So, and she's here to sign books for you as well. And I'm sure many of you remember when she was our lecturer 2 years ago. So with that, I will turn it over to Cami.
Hello, and welcome to the 43rd Annual Stegner Lecture. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker for the evening, Kim Barnes. Kim Barnes has served as Idaho's writer-in-residence, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and has been published in numerous notable magazines and anthologies. Kim Barnes was born in Lewiston and grew up in an Orofino Creek logging camp, which gave her a unique perspective on nature and on life itself. She later returned to Lewiston, where she graduated from high school. She became an alumnus of LCSC, earning her BA in English. Later, she would go on to earn both her MA and MFA from WSU and the University of Montana, respectively. She has written many works, one of the most notable being her initial memoir, In the Wilderness, Coming of Age in Unknown Country. In this work, she documents growing up around loggers, her background, and her early life. She also takes an initial dive into her trauma. This memoir touched the hearts of many, including me. Her work also appears in More Magazine, Shenandoah, the Georgia Review, Iron Horse Literary Review, O Magazine, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many more. Additionally, she has published several novels: In the Kingdom of Men, Finding Caruso, A Country Called Home. She has also co-edited 2 anthologies: Circle of Women, an anthology of Western women writers, and Kiss Tomorrow, Hello, Notes from Midlife Underground by 25 women over 40. Kim Barnes is a distinguished professor emerita at the University of Idaho in Moscow. She resides on Moscow Mountain with her husband, the poet Robert Wrigley. This particular Stegner lecture, The Unknown World, Stegner, The Wilderness of Grief, focuses on the nature of grief. Nature in and of itself exists within the dichotomy of life and death. Tulips cannot grow without rotted leaves. Sunlight must give way to moonlight. Nestled in between this natural dichotomy is grief. Just as the tree remembers the axe's blows, so do our epigenetics remember the intergenerational trauma dealt. During my own reading of her works, I was struck with how descriptive the natural scenes were. I felt as if I were transported in between the pages of her memoirs and essays, feeling the river's waters lap against my skin and squinting in the sunlight. I could taste the food that she wrote about in her memoir. I was fully immersed in her world, and it was wonderful. Besides focusing on nature, she focuses on speaking out in feminist topics. Kim is an inspirational woman who chose to speak out rather than to be silenced. Silence is where secrets go to live, and the written word is where secrets go to die. There is no shame in abuse or grief or processing your trauma. By choosing to share her religious, familial, and interpersonal experiences through her writing, she has helped many people process their own in healthy ways. By being an example, she has shown and told many that there is no shame in speaking out. I believe she puts it best when she says, "We don't really know what it looks like to have a female tragic hero, and we're not sure if we want it. I'm pretty intent on wanting it, because Aristotle said that women cannot be tragic because they are not noble enough to fall." To me, this passage means that it's as if women are meant to be the tragic heroes of our stories. We are our own tragic heroes when we speak out. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Kim Barnes.
Thank you, Cammie. And thank you all for coming. It's always wonderful to be here, my hometown, where I came to be aware of myself in ways I couldn't have dreamed when I was that girl in the logging camp. I want to thank Jenny Anderson and the LC crew for organizing and supporting such an important and communal inquiry and celebration. And thanks to the library, which I just love this library. I have to admit, when this library first opened, I was giving a reading here, and I didn't know anybody. I had moved from here. I'd been gone for quite a while, and I walked in and I said, "Wow, this is Lewiston?" I mean, owning it, right? I mean, this is my town, and I fear I offended some folks, but I meant it as a compliment because it's an amazing building and an amazing space, and I'm so honored to be here. Now, we're going to see if I can figure this out. Is this your?
This is, do you want me to?
I think I can. I think I can do it.
Yeah, it's just the key. So just that one.
Okay, not the up and down, but the back and
Yeah.
forth. Okay. Thank you all for coming, for being here. By the time I first met Wallace Stegner in 1983, he was here to give what would become the first annual Stegner Lecture. I had read most of his major works of fiction and nonfiction, and I was a fan. I was finishing my degree in English at LC and had just been accepted into the graduate program at WSU. His inscription on my copy of All the Little Live Things reads, "For Kim Barnes with a loud wish for her graduate future." And you're welcome to look at this if you'd like. His cursive handwriting is as elegant and precise as he was. Like him, it suggests a Victorian lilt. I'm an anachronism, he often said, by which he meant he was a person belonging or appropriate to a period other than that in which he existed, especially a person who is conspicuously old-fashioned. That sense of being old-fashioned had mostly to do with his noble carriage and coded demeanor. He was, as many who knew him noted, a very principled man in most every aspect of his life. He championed environmental conservation, especially the preservation of the American West natural landscapes. His advocacy, including foundational work with the Sierra Club, helped build the moral and literary framework of modern environmentalism, including the continued preservation of the national parks, and what now simply is known as the Wilderness Letter, which directly influenced the passage of the Wilderness Act of 1964, one of the most important pieces of environmental legislation in U.S. history. He believed in integrity in writing and was committed to historical and emotional truth in both fiction and nonfiction. As a teacher, he founded the Stanford Creative Writing Program. And as a mentor, he emphasized craft, honesty, and responsibility in storytelling, encouraging generations of writers to do the same, including Sandra Day O'Connor, Simon Danishvar, Scott Momaday, Andrew Glaze, George V. Higgins, Thomas McGuane, Robert Stone, Terry Tempest Williams, Ken Kesey, who he could not stand, Gordon Lish, Ernest Gaines, Larry McMurtry, Scott Turow, Tilly Olson, Nancy Parker, and Ed Abbey. And as Jenny noted, several of those people have given the lecture since. Of course, Stegner had complexities and contradictions that played out in his personal and public life. Some critics have noted tensions between his idealism and his privilege, and have pointed out how his portrayals of the West sometimes marginalize indigenous and other non-white voices. His ideals, deep reverence for place, historical continuity, and moral clarity often came into conflict with the messiness of real life, especially in the American West he so loved. He could be very forthcoming and vulnerable, while at the same time remaining reticent, more than willing to expose his narrative truths while maintaining an air of detachment and immutability. While in the middle of reading a biography of John Steinbeck, he wrote to a friend, "How do people get that personal? How do they express so freely what they feel? Steinbeck makes my inverted Puritan hide crawl at times, maybe with envy, maybe with pity. Neither an emotion he tolerated in himself or others." This evening, I want to focus on one aspect of Stegner that seems especially informative and perhaps even defining in the context of his life and work, and that is grief. Because what I sensed during the short time I was in his company, and even now in the presence of his work, is a deep underlying current of emotion that I intuitively understand then and now to be grave, a complex state of being based in survival with all of its connotations of mental, emotional, and physical trauma. A state of being with which I am intimately familiar, and I'll be glad to talk about this more in the Q&A after the talk. I'm inordinately fond of thought experiments, and one that I love to put in front of my students is this. Are you a writer of lament or celebration? Everyone wants to argue that they are both, of course, and most are, but within the confines of the experiment, we must consider a dominant mythology and tone. To further the discussion, I ask, are you defined by the tenets of mercy or grace? I want each of you to think about this. Even if you're not a writer, it's what you bring to the writings as a reader and what you respond to. Mercy, by definition, Mr. Riley?
Mercy, giving.
That is part of it. Mercy is when you are not given the punishment you deserve. This is in Judeo-Christian mythologies, stories, beliefs. This is what the king does. The king can give you mercy. I was raised in the Pentecostal church. That was Old Testament thinking. Because grace, which is what brings us into the New Testament with Christ's sacrifice, occurs when you are given the forgiveness and salvation you don't deserve. Flannery O'Connor's particular and provocative territory. If you want to read about grace, read Flannery O'Connor. What I have come to believe is that Stegner's wilderness letter, like so much of his writing, was lament, cloaked as advocacy and defense, and that for him as an individual and for our country, defined by colonization, what he understood most of all was that the post-lapsarian concept of the fall from grace was what defined us. Post-lapsarian, prelapsarian. Prelapsarian simply means before the fall from the garden. Post-lapsarian means after the fall. Again, how do you see the world? Through which lens? Are you fallen? They call it the fortunate fall for a reason. What he understood, what I believe he understood, is that we need unruined places because we are a ruined people. We need a place that holds us in awe of what we cannot name, a place that reflects and reminds us of what we have lost, a place to mourn and somehow to hope, even if those two things live uncomfortably together in what might be called an angle of repose. What I want to speak for is not so much the wilderness uses, valuable as those are, but the wilderness idea, which is a resource in itself, being an intangible and spiritual resource, it will seem mystical to the practical minded. I want to speak for the wilderness idea as something that has helped form our character and that has certainly shaped our history as a people. I want to first consider the word wilderness, its definition and etymology, as a way to underpin our understanding of the complexity of grief that Stegner and many, many others have experienced. Wilderness refers to a wild, untamed area of land. It symbolizes freedom. The concept evokes a sense of isolation, mystery, and raw beauty, where human influence is minimal or absent. Now, what I love is what comes next, because I didn't know this. How many degrees do I have in English? The word wilderness comes from Middle English, and it's probably Vilda. Does anyone speak Old English? Where's Harold? Is Harold? Is it? Would you say Vilda or Wilda?
The V would be more German.
Okay, so Wilda.
Wilda.
Yeah, and then comes the second part. Was it the word for deer? And how would you pronounce that?
Deer.
What he said. It means wild deer, the place of wild deer. And it illustrates the idea of untamed creatures that roam freely and reflects the nature of human emotions. The second word I want to consider is grief and its derivation.
Just to put in, since
Go ahead.
At that time, the word deer meant any animal.
Any wild animal. Yeah, it wasn't just whitetail or muley. Right. Yes.
Cougars and lions.
Yes. And I think it's also interesting that we often think of wilderness as this place. So I grew up with the Bible, the wilderness where Christ went into, I thought was my wilderness, which looked like this, all these trees. I never thought of the desert as the wilderness. And it turns out the wilderness was also where they would go, where their domesticated animals would be, where they could contemplate. So our sense of the wilderness as being wild and the law of nature versus the law of man isn't everyone's idea of wilderness. And I think it is a state of mind in so many ways. Now, grief is a profound sorrow, emotional suffering, often caused by loss, especially the death of a loved one. And one of the reasons I chose this subject this evening is because I lost my mother in November. And she was here at my last Stegner lecture. Her death was unexpected. And I have never felt this kind of grief. And I thought I could talk about that, and I hope I can in the Q&A, but I have never felt like I was wandering so lost in the wilderness. That day I posted, "My mama is gone and the world is unrecognizable to me." The etymology of grief comes, I'm so glad you're here, comes from the Old French grief, meaning sorrow or distress, which itself comes from the Latin gravare or gravare. Do you think, Harold? You don't know? I go to the Italian, so it would be gravare.
Go for it.
Meaning to burden or weigh down, and is linked to the word gravis, meaning heavy. It is not linked to the word grave, as in what we dig, which I thought was interesting, which comes from the word for trench and other things. But those two are not related. Grief is articulated, defined, and classified in a number of ways. One that is called normal, common grief. And I think of someone who said to me, a student, when I said, "Tell me about your unreasonable fears." And she said, "There is no such thing as unreasonable fears." And in that way, I think, is there such a thing as common grief? There is anticipatory grief, which we've been hearing a lot about, and that sense of grieving before it's gone. Complicated grief, disenfranchised grief, and traumatic grief. We understand that grief is a response to the loss of loved ones, to illness, death, or betrayal. To lose friendship, love, marriage, community, even religion can result in grief. There's a particular kind of grief called solastalgia. The loss of landscape and place, even as you remain in it, is a kind of nostalgia. Do you remember the poet who said, who is this? Bob, where's my husband, the poet? Who said, "When in Kyoto, I long for Kyoto"?
Basho.
Yeah, that's who it was. When in Kyoto, I long for Kyoto. There is the loss of a way of life, of how things used to be, the loss of jobs, careers, emotional and financial security, and there is the loss of sense of self that can come through trauma or through personal fault and failure. Have you ever grieved your own feelings? I have. A breaking down of the codes we live by. And I'm going to stop right here and say that the disorientation, trauma, and grief that so many are experiencing at this very moment in time is profoundly resonant and is, in fact, the very scenario that Stegner might have feared and foreseen. By way of synecdoche, I'm retired, now I get to act like a teacher again. What's synecdoche? Does anyone remember? I love the word synecdoche. Have any of you ever read The Year of Decision? It's written via synecdoche, which is a figure of speech that Stegner was fond of, in which a part is made to represent the whole. And this way, it's a kind of metaphor. I want to focus on traumas and griefs that were particular to Stegner and his writing, especially in his novels Big Rock Candy Mountain and Angle of Repose, as well as his nonfiction classic, Wolf Willow, a book of memoirs set in the Cypress Hills in southern Saskatchewan, where Stegner's family homesteaded from 1914 to 1920. This is young Wallace and his mother, Hilda. Stegner has written, he was a strange child. Now he clung to her skirt so closely that he hampered her walking, and she laid her hand on his head and kept it there because she knew that somewhere deep down in his prematurely old mind, he lived with fear. Wallace Stegner's father, George Stegner, there's no history or photographs of George Stegner. They simply cannot be found because he was a grifter. He was a rum runner. He was a dreamer and a schemer who often abandoned the family for months at a time. At home, he was drunk and brutally abusive, beating Wallace to the point of breaking bones. He mocked and humiliated his youngest son, calling him a crybaby, a mama's boy, disgusting, pathetic, a runt. In fact, Wallace was often sick, thin, and pale. Later, it was discovered that the cause of his being cold all the time was due to Raynaud's syndrome. And I don't know if any of you have that. I do, yeah. So it's a sympathetic nerve system where it cuts off all the circulation to your hands and feet. And he had this even as a child. At age 5, Stegner and his brother Cecil, age 7, were left at the Sacred Heart Orphanage in Seattle while their father was absent and their mother worked at the Bon Marché, unable to fully support or feed them. And isn't poverty its own kind of grief? Stegner's first dim memory was of huddling with his homeless family in a makeshift tent in Redmond, Washington. His first clear memory was of being in the orphanage, how hungry he was, and the smell of buttered bread being passed among the children. Cecil would fight for a piece to share with Wallace. The orphanage was its own kind of wilderness, unknown, fearful, chaotic, and defined by the basic needs of existence: shelter, water, and food. They called it an asylum, the Sacred Heart Orphan Asylum. I'm going to have to get a cough something here. It's a little dry in this valley. Bob, do you have something that'd be great? Better than trying to find the... Oh, perfect. Thank you. Does everybody know the Heimlich maneuver? Or as my husband calls it, the Heimlich maneuver. It works either way.
These are going to be a little intense.
Desperate, Hilda Stegner returned to her Iowa family home and asked her strict Lutheran father if she could divorce. He insisted that unless adultery were involved, she must remain married. It wasn't long after that the family moved to Saskatchewan, one of dozens of moves that would define Stegner's need to be what he called a sticker, to belong. Stegner's parents' marriage, his father, the boomer, as in boom and bust, his mother, the nester, suggest an allegory of the West itself, which Stegner saw as perpetually and fatally torn between a destructive antisocial individualism and a too often stymied longing for stability and community. Stegner's formation was simultaneous with the founding of the town. So when they moved there, it was just being called a town. It wasn't even a settlement. As he grew, so did the settlement. This parallel genesis gave him a profound sense of identity and belonging. Unlike his father, who was possessed of wanderlust, he was, he realized, a belonger. Whatever landscape a child is exposed to early on, that will be the sort of gauze through which he or she will see all the world afterwards. At first, The Stegners lived in tents and whatever shelter could be found, finally settling into a retired boxcar near the tracks, their home until George Stegner built a real house with a well. Look at this house. I never lived in a house like that when I was a kid. We lived in 8x20 shotgun shacks, one room, no running water, no toilet, no electricity. This is a nice house. He did a good job. Which meant that young Wally no longer had to carry buckets of water dipped from the icy Frenchman River. And it's a really interesting prairie river. Have any of you ever been here? Up in this part? To me, this is not the river I grew up with. This is not the Clearwater. This is not the Lochsa. But he loved this river. While living in East End, Stegner and his family were infected, isolated, and survived the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. Grief permeated the town. The experience informed Stegner's sense of fear and uncertainty, but also survival and resilience. There is no story without loss, not for the individual, the community, the country, or the human condition. And he said everybody in town was enlisted. And he writes amazingly about these memories of the sick and then people coming in from outside the town to help, and then they would become infected and they would die. No one was left untouched. Nostalgia for East End was an ongoing focus and point of return for Stegner. His life was divided by this line: before East End and after. The prairie was his prelapsarian place, a place of innocence, the natural world, the garden. The smell of wolf willow, Stegner said, was to him what the Madeleine was to Proust, the transcendent objective correlative for his childhood in East End. And perhaps one of Stegner's most recognized quotes, one that is hard to argue with. We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in, for it can be a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope. Then again, as former Idaho writer-in-residence C. Marie Furman, who's with us tonight, noted during her 2023 Stegner lecture, maybe hope as a landscape only exists within privilege, and power is only afforded to those for whom the geography is not also within them. For the privileged, hope may be the short view, like the photograph that can hold only so much, that can show only a bit of an entire landscape. For I believe that wilderness to native people, native fishes, and even some poets is not so easily labeled, is not seen as commodity. It is not wilderness at all, but is life, is home. Maybe there's nothing but wilderness, nothing but home. And knowing this means that we too are part of the landscape, and that what was inflicted would cause native people and beings to gain an emotion they hadn't yet needed, to lose what was home in the name of another's hope. In her essay, Why I Can't Read Wallace Stegner, Elizabeth Cook Lynn takes Stegner to task for echoing Frederick Jackson Turner's observation that history stopped in 1890. The phrase refers to the U.S. Census Bureau's declaration that the American frontier was closed. There was no more unsettled land, and the Indian way of life was done. But if Turner saw this as the end of a uniquely American era, Stegner took it further. It was not just the end of a historical phase, but the beginning of a moral, existential, and ecological reckoning. Stegner's championing of wild lands rang not only with hope, but with a Cassandran warning. For Stegner, that idea that history stopped is not about stasis, but about entropy. Do I get to ask you if you know what entropy is? I love entropy. It refers to a state of disorder or unpredictability when we talk about it in emotions, but it's a term of physics. But entropy is interesting because it's the end, it's the exhaustion of order, which requires energy. And when that energy is expended, you fall into entropy, which by any other name is death. It's a new order, but it is a kind of death. After 1890, the myth of manifest destiny gave way to a more painful reality: displacement and genocide of native peoples, rivers dammed and dying, exhausted soil, and as Stegner saw it, generations of individuals like his father destroyed by a myth that never fully held. Stegner's fiction and nonfiction, from Big Rock Candy Mountain and Angle of Repose to Wolf Willow, are filled with characters who arrived too late for the promise of the West, a failed promise that resulted in the destruction of the very dream they were chasing, and more devastating, the destruction of Native people's way of living and knowing the land, of life itself. Stegner often seemed possessed of a kind of soul-nostalgic amnesia. His characters grieved not only for what was, but for what never truly existed, a West that was pure, open, golden, and redemptive, and as Furman notes, too often fail to consider that their sense of home, belonging, and hope was built on the grief of others. Has anybody read this book? It's a play on a geography of hope. Stegner's famous line called A Geography of Blood. Albertan writer Candace Savage, best known for her delightful nonfiction book, Bird Brains. Have you seen that book? It's very popular. It's about how birds think. Attempts to address this from a colonizer's perspective in her memoir, A Geography of Blood. When she and her partner moved to Stegner's hometown of East End, she becomes aware of a haunting she can't identify or explain. As her inquiries and explorations take her deeper into the true history of her family and the land they claimed, she uncovers a dark reality, a story of cruelty and survival set in the still recent past, the intentional extinction of the Plains buffalo in service of the attempted genocide of the native peoples, as well as the abuse and abandonment that defined her own mother's life. Hope and blood are never far apart, that echo tone where desire and destruction meet, where the narrative of infinite possibility transitions into entropy, chaos, loss, and grief. When Stegner was 12, the family left one kind of wilderness for another, and the saints of Salt Lake City. Hi, my brother and sister-in-law are here. Hi! him. Where George ran liquor down from Canada. So the Saints, or the people who lived around the Saints, had an enormous thirst for liquor. And he made so much money bringing liquor from Canada down into Salt Lake City that they actually could afford to live in houses, but they couldn't afford to live them very long because he was always on the lam. So they moved 15 times just from one house to another. They were never listed in the phone book. And George also opened a blind pig. Do you know what that is? It's a speakeasy. They're called blind pigs. We had them here in Lewiston. Stegner remained small for his age and sickly, but he had found his place and his people. His Mormon classmates and their families took him in, and he began attending weekly meetings and joined the Boy Scouts, eventually attaining the rank of Eagle Scout. His junior year of high school, he grew 6 inches. Accelerated in his studies so that they put him into his older brother's class, and joined the basketball and tennis teams. Finally, he had found his place among people who themselves had been wandering in the wilderness, besieged by violence and grief, and though he seldom spoke of it, their own besiegement of native populations. He was, he said, a Gentile in a new Jerusalem, but finally he belonged. He attributed some of his kinship with the LDS community to coming to them as a blank state, tabula rasa. He was nothing, he said, nobody, without a sense of history, empty of all identity. Unlike his father, he longed to be a sticker, which informed and defined his life from this point forward. I'm really interested in how, even though he himself didn't convert to Mormonism, and they did not try to convert him, they took him in and they gave him everything that he wanted. Identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of community. They saw him in this way.
Is that mercy or grace?
I would bet that LDS would say grace. He abided by those tenets for the rest of his life. They gave him a moral underpinning that he could work inside of. He became the president of his literary fraternity. And then came 1931, a year of transition. Stegner had found his home in the wilderness, but the grief and trauma of his father's criminal brutality and his growing awareness of his mother's sacrifice and suffering caused him to wish his father dead. His desire to literally kill his father had taken hold years before, when after a terrible beating, he had hidden behind an outbuilding and pointed an empty cartridge at his father's back, imagining how he might pull the trigger. In 1931, just as Stegner was entering a time of seemingly limitless aspiration, ambition, and achievement, deeply bound to his group of friends and community, his brother Cecil died of pneumonia at the age of 24 after helping a stranded motorist free his car from deep snow. 2 years later, he experienced the defining grief of his life. At the age of 50, his mother was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer and died at home with her youngest son by her side, but not her husband, who, unable to stay in the face of it, disappeared until after she had passed, a betrayal Stegner could never forgive. Her last words were, "You're a good boy, Wallace." On June 15th, 1939, his father, now falling apart mentally and financially, first shot his lover to death and then killed himself in a seedy Salt Lake City hotel. When Stegner, who had been struggling with the final section while he was writing The Big Rock Candy Mountain, which is basically a memoir. It's all of this is in that that novel. He freely admitted he was writing his life, trying to exorcise the demon of his father. When he received word of his father's death, he responded, "Well, now I know how my book ends." And that is how it ends. He buried his entire family, an honest orphan. First his brother, then his mother, and then his father, whose grave he swore would remain unmarked, and it is to this day. You can see Cecil on your left and then Hilda, and the father is there, but not noted. Another story broken, defined not only by loss and grief, but by chaos and tropic disorder. Writing would prove a way for Stegner to make sense of his life. Again and again, he would tell the same story from different perspectives. It became his master narrative. What comes after is, in its way, a hard-won fairy tale, a deep love, a long marriage, a son who shared his father's joy in words, stories, and landscape, a lauded career as a teacher, conservationist, and writer, winner of more prizes and awards than one can keep track of, including the National Book Award. He lived for decades in California and then Vermont, places where he felt a great sense of belonging, of being a sticker. All these things were what he believed was the answer to loss of meaning, to placelessness, to grief. Mary Paulson he met in Iowa. It is something, it can be everything, he said, to have found a fellow bird with whom you can sit among the rafters while the drinking and boasting and reciting and fighting go on below. A fellow bird whom you can look after and find bugs and seeds for, one who will patch your bruises and straighten your ruffled feathers and mourn over your hurts when you accidentally fly into something you can't handle. He taught at Harvard. He and Marion Page traveled the world, all over. I like this picture in Hawaii. And then he came to Stanford, and he began the Stanford Writing Program. He's the one who started that. By the way, before I forget, I wanted to tell you that when he started at the University of Utah, his first teacher, writing teacher, was Bartus Fisher, who was this cantankerous Jack Mormon, who was just cranky as all get out. But he saw that Stegner can write, and he's the one who encouraged him. I want to stop here at the end of this chapter of Stegner's life because to consider a type of grief that might not be thought of as such, a break of principles, of the codes he lived by. And that's in Palo Alto. Angle of Repose, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and what many have come to see as betrayal, brought grief of a different kind to his life and to the lives of others. Chaos, he said, is the law of nature. Order is the dream of men. In 1970, Stegner began dictating what he felt would be his masterwork, Angle of Repose, which tells the story of Lyman Ward, a retired historian who is wheelchair-bound due to an illness that has rendered him immobile. He tells us that he is trying to make sense of his own failed marriage. I love the detail that this character's wife ran off with a surgeon who cut off his leg. There's some irony there. And the family relationships by researching his grandparents, Susan and Oliver Ward, who lived, now this is a novel he's writing, who lived during the late 19th century in the American West. Lyman's research focuses on Susan, a writer and artist, and her life with Oliver, a mining engineer, as they navigate the hardships and challenges of frontier life in Boise, by the way. The title, Angle of Repose, is both literal and metaphorical. And it dawned on me as I was researching this, I have always thought about the angle of repose as a kind of resolution of coming to rest. And that's not true, metaphorically. Stegner always talked about of humans, as being vertical. You needed to stay vertical, because if you were horizontal, you were dead. And so that sense of angle of repose as being a kind of resolution of things settling into rest turns out to be not what he had in mind at all. I love this painting. It's the angle of repose of the Utah desert, and then this female the painting of this woman lying there. Susan's story is told through letters she wrote to her friend Augusta Hudson, providing a personal and intimate account of her experiences as she adapts to a new life in a mining town. As Lyman delves into his family history, he not only learns about his grandparents' lives, but also about his own, confronting his personal struggles and the complexities of family relationships. Again, Stegner revisits that tenuous liminal space between salvation and devastation and the grief it holds, where we mourn what was lost and cling to what remains. It might have represented a kind of resolution for Stegner, the romanticization of a life defined by agency, error, and redemptive self-awareness. There's no doubt that Stegner's portrayal of Susan Ward is a projection of what he might have hoped for his mother. I've come to believe, and I'll be telling you more momentarily, but in the novel, Susan is an artist, she's educated, she's brilliant, she's beautiful, she's adaptable. And he saw that as who his mother might have been if it hadn't been for his father. Now, he didn't believe in writing fairy tales, so there is a great complication in this novel. The story itself he had discovered by accident, having been introduced to the writings and journals of Mary Halleck Foote, whose true story he found fascinating and compelling enough to ask her family for permission to use it as the basis for his next novel, to which they agreed, handing over her original manuscripts, notes, and diaries. He became enthralled. I feel the pull of it even now, and his fictionalization of the story became enmeshed with Foote's own writings. A different kind of grief came with the publication of Angle of Repose. Stegner made a decision that would tarnish his sterling reputation as a man of essential decency, that old-fashioned, hard-working goodness characterized by stoicism, endurance, and sacrifice. What happened, and some of you know this, I think. Mary Halleck Foote was a very real woman. She was an artist. She was a writer. She was very well known. She was an illustrator. Her husband, in fact, was an engineer, a mining engineer, and came to Boise to implement this huge irrigation project, which eventually got done, by the way, and is still a part of the Boise Valley. Stegner had known of her writing, of Mary Halleck Foote's writing. She published books and essays and short stories. He even taught them in his classes. When he discovered that she had an unpublished memoir and letters, he became fascinated and asked the family, the granddaughter, if he might read them. And they said, of course, this is Wallace Stegner. And they gave him free access to all of her writings. And he said, I think I can make this into a novel. And they said, go ahead. And he said, oh, I won't use direct quotes. And it will be fictionalized, of course. It will be based on your grandmother, but it won't be her story. By the time it was done, in fact, he had used her letters in direct quotes. And he had done something else. This was considered plagiarism. But the family, they didn't care about that. They figured he would use her letters. What his family cared about was that he changed their grandmother's story. And the way he changed it was he gave Susan, who is the fictional character, not adaptability, but just the opposite. She came to hate her life. She came to hate her husband, and she started, we assume, having an affair with her husband's coworker. Now, this didn't happen to Mary Halleck Foote. It happens in the novel. While she is in a dalliance with her lover, her daughter comes to the edge of a canal and falls in and drowns. Cammie, that's as close as we get to female tragedy. She brought it on herself. When the family read that, they were devastated. And they said, you can't write that. Everybody, because he used all the real stuff. He used the real places. He used, the only thing he changed was names. And he refused. He refused to back down. Insisted that he had permission. And not only that, he refused to acknowledge it in the book itself. Critics pointed out that he altered her life story to suit his narrative. He argued for historical integrity, yet used her voice without honoring her agency as a historical figure. This is an interesting illustration of Mary Halleckfoot and Wallace Stegner. And you can feel the tension that existed. And the family never forgave him, and he never withdrew. It was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Her own book, which he took all this from, A Victorian Gentlewoman in the West, was published 2 years later. It was rediscovered because of what Stegner had written. Unfortunately, in my mind, he argued that he had done her a favor. How is this about grief, the resolution of grief, the desire for ownership, for saving the mother, angle of repose as resolution, as entropy, as death? His reputation would never be the same. And even, he was a stubborn man. And he had his father's temper. He could become very angry, and man, did he hold a grudge. And once he made up his mind, he would not change it. What do I think? Does that make him a monster? Not in my mind. It makes him very flawed as someone who made a terrible decision. I think he became so invested in this story that he couldn't let it go. And I also think she was such a good writer, he couldn't even change the words. She's an amazing writer. All the best parts are hers. In the novel, at the end, Lyman says, as grandmother's biographer, I'd have to guess she was never really happy after, say, her 37th year, the last year when she lived an idol in Boise Canyon. But she lived a long time after that, Ellen said. She lives to be 91. But she wasn't happy. She wasn't unhappy either. Do you have to be one or the other? Stegner said he would hate to be young again. Work with the earth, not against it, for the earth does not belong to you. You belong to the earth. This was one side of his personality. What belonged to him and what he belonged to was another. He said there is a sense in which we are all each other's consequences. And I've been thinking about that a great deal. We are all bound in this way. This is Stegner shortly before his death. When he was 83, 84. He was in Santa Fe giving a reading, and he failed to yield, which has become a very dark joke amongst his friends, and was in a car accident that busted his ribs, and he died of complications not long after. All I can think of is acceptance, acknowledgement, and restraint, acceptance of the limitations of the country, acknowledgement of the incompatibility of solitude and resort activities, and restraint of our devouring heart. Most things break, including hearts. The lessons of life amount not to wisdom, but to scar tissue and callous. I shall be richer all my life for this sorrow. Thank you. I know some of you may have to go, and I'm also very happy to stay here and take any questions you might have, including about my own life and my writing and how Stegner informed my sense of my story.